7th COVID-19 Resilience Talk Speaker Series. I'm Debbie Magnesi. I'm the Assistant Dean of Development at D'Amore-McKim School of Business. And we're so glad you're all here to join us for this conversation today. As you know, we're here to talk about community and building it prior to COVID-19, during, and what community will look like after COVID-19. Before I introduce our co-moderators, just a few words about the Resilience series if this is your first time joining us. So my wonderful team at D'Amore-McKim put together this series of talks as a way to bring our community and our friends together during a time of physical distancing. We are aiming to bring you value and give you some opportunities for lifelong learning in connection to this school. So if you joined us before, welcome back. If this is your first talk, we have several more coming up that we will post into the group chat towards the end of the call. So without further ado, it is my honor today to introduce our co-moderators, Gregory and Abhishek Balakrishnan. Many of you know and love Dan as a former professor of entrepreneurship and innovation at DMSB. He is also the founder and a board member of Mosaic, the umbrella organization for Northeastern's entrepreneurial ecosystem, as well as the founding faculty advisor of IDEA and the co-chair of the McCarthy's Venture Mentoring Network. Abhi is a member of the D'Amore-McKim class of 2020, and he has served as the Alt-Schuler-Meyer CEO of IDEA for the past year. He was recently named one of Poets and Quant's 100 Best and Brightest Business Graduates of 2020, and I believe he was also named to the Huntington 100. So we're very proud of you, Abhi. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Just a note to all that this event is being recorded for future viewing. To that end, we're going to turn off everyone's videos, and we ask that you keep all of your microphones off as well so we can get a clean recording to share with the rest of our alumni. I encourage you to click the button in the top right hand of your screen to look at the speaker view, which will pop up since we have several speakers as part of this panel. It will highlight for you who is the one speaking. And throughout the conversation, I encourage you to write in any questions you have into the chat. My team and Abhi will be tracking on these questions, so you can either send them directly to one of us or into the group chat, and the panelists will certainly find some time to answer them during this conversation. So again, welcome, and I will hand it over to Dan and Abhi.
Thank you, Debbie. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking some time for this. The topic that we are addressing is community building and COVID. The events of the last couple of weeks really make it incumbent upon us, since we are talking about community, to include the Black Lives Matter and the whole set of events that have occurred in the recent past as a result of George Floyd's death. That news hit us, all of us, as we were quarantined in our houses in fear of going outside. And it made all of us realize, all of us who thought about it, that there are people who have spent their entire life scared to go outdoors. And as long as we're talking about community, while this is around entrepreneurship generally, we have to recognize that communities are designed for certain people who have certain interests. They should be inclusive, but as long as you have community, there will always be people inside that community and other people outside that community for whom it's not interesting. So I think that's out there, and I wanted to address it up front. Because of the newness of COVID and the situation with following George Floyd's death, we have panelists who are great on the topic of community, but none of us are experts. We've been working at this for 3 months to try to understand COVID. So to the extent possible, we want to make this both a panel discussion, but also a conversation. And so that is why we went the extra half an hour. Most of these are an hour. So we've designed this to be an hour of panel talk, followed by a half an hour of open conversation. Abhi is my co-moderator. I'm going to ask him to talk a little bit now about how you might interact with us over the course of the next 90 minutes. Abhi?
Hey, Dan, thanks. Hey, everyone. Nice to see some incredible people on this call. Like Dan said, this is a great conversation around community, and we have some incredible community builders on this panel who I've worked with in the past, but who also have done some incredible things to foster and done some work in fostering an inclusive and amazing community, especially during a time where we're all digital as well. But yeah, I'm looking forward to also moderating the questions part of it. So if you guys have any questions during the conversation that takes place, feel free to use the chat feature at the bottom to input your question. If it pertains to the current conversation, I'll try to interject and get your question out there to add to the conversation. If not, like Dan said, there's going to be a section towards the second half of the conversation where we'll have more of a Q&A area, and we'll save that question for there. But till then, super excited to see what this conversation looks like, and really looking forward to seeing things unravel. So off to you, Dan.
Yeah, and if you asked a question and it does get put off to the end, that's where most of the conversation is going to be. So I'd like to now introduce the panelists, and I'm just going to ask Jordan Lynn to start off, and then we'll move on from there.
Thanks, Dan. So hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Communities are super important now more than ever. And whether you're a part of a community, you're looking to build one, or you're looking to improve it, I think that we might have some ideas and thoughts for you about that, and I'm excited to share them. So the community I'm going to be representing today is IDEA. Some of you might not be sure what IDEA is. Some of you are from IDEA or the Mosaic ecosystem, but basically the common thread between all of the panelists here today is our involvement in IDEA. For those of you who aren't familiar, IDEA is Northeastern's venture accelerator, which brings together students, faculty, staff, and alumni from a wide variety of backgrounds and industries, and teaches them how to navigate the complex process of taking an idea to an MVP and an MVP to launch. I served as the director of the community and operations team at IDEA for the past year, where we really work to understand and consider the needs of each stakeholder group, connect them, and strategically provide helpful programming and resources. As mentioned, we exist within a larger ecosystem of Mosaic, which Dan had a big hand in founding, which essentially brings together all these different student organizations with different spikes and strengths and backgrounds and different focuses to empower us to think collectively about how we can build a better future. So that's the community I'll be representing today.
Thank you very much. Roy Liu.
Hi, folks. As Jordan had mentioned, my connection to this group is primarily through the IDEA program. I've been on the advisory board and have participated in almost every gap funding meeting for the past 9 years. In my other life, I am a finance person at a firm called Hercules Capital and have been there for 15 years. We primarily work with venture-backed startups, both early and later stage in tech and life sciences.
Thank you. Nina?
Thank you, Dan. Hi, everybody. My name is Nina Stepanov. I am currently, outside of Northeastern's association, a principal investor at a fund called Accelerator. We're a pre-seed B2B SaaS accelerator, seed stage fund, and corporate innovation consultancy. So do quite a bit with a really small team. So kind of participate in quite a few things across the board within the fund. At Northeastern, I originally started out within the Entrepreneurs Club under Greg Skloot, and then Chris Wolfel actually dragged me over to IDEA pretty swiftly after joining the community, and I spent the rest of my time at Northeastern part of IDEA in multiple roles, from social media management all the way up to running kind of the entire marketing and community side of IDEA, which was a lot of fun and something that I definitely pull on nowadays. And I think that's probably quite relevant, a lot of why I'm involved here today. Also part of a lot of communities outside of obviously Northeastern and my own job, but excited to dive into those. For the sake of clarity, I graduated from DMSB in 2016. And I won't go into my co-ops, even though I do love talking about them. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Chris Wolfel.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chris Wolfel. I was got involved with IDEA back in 2009, 2010 timeframe, early days when there was less people involved than are on this Zoom call. So it's kind of amazing to see how much it's grown. Was CEO in 2012 and 2013, and since then have gone on to co-found a marketing software company, and then am currently co-founder and CEO of a platform called Helpful that's actually built for community enablement, built off of a lot of the learnings that I had from being part of a lot of different ecosystems and communities, including IDEA, the Techstars Alumni Network, and the Youth Cities Accelerator and Incubator for high potential middle school and high school students. So I'll kind of be bringing some of the views and learnings from probably about 10 years of trying to build communities, mainly in the startup world, to this.
Great. Thank you, Chris. We are all have, as was said, we have a common sharing of a background in IDEA, but this will not be, Jordan is going to focus exclusively on IDEA, but this will not be just about ideas, about communities generally. I spent 14 years at Northeastern before recognizing my addiction and trying to cure myself by retiring last spring. I've spent a lot of the time really thinking about what it was that we created, because it's very special when you take a step back and look at the number of students involved, young alums involved, faculty involved, older alums involved, and just friends of the university. And I realized that Northeastern is really a unique place. It has a unique culture. It attracts a particular kind of student. And we designed over time this entrepreneurship system to work for that community. So I made the tremendous leap and realized that, in fact, what we were talking about is a community-based entrepreneurship system. And so the uniqueness of Northeastern is reflected in the community-based entrepreneurship program that we've designed. And while a lot of people are excited about what we have today and engaged in it, it is recognized nationally and internationally as a unique ecosystem. The first 4 or 5 years I was at Northeastern, we struggled to figure out how to build something for this community. And about 10 years ago, with the launching of IDEA, we began to get on the right path, in my view, and things really heated up. The way I'd like to talk about communities today is to talk about the characteristics of communities that make them sustainable and strong, and then immediately go into the situation that we find ourselves in today, facing the challenges that we do, and see how those characteristics will hold up. So there's just the things that I found out about what makes this thing work is that it's organic versus a top-down imperative. No one in leadership said, I want it to look this way, let's go build it. It has grown organically to become what it is today. The power of intrinsic motivation amongst community members is the most important engine that there is. People are doing it because they benefit or because they feel they're benefiting other people. They're not doing it for the money. They're not doing it. There's no academic credit being handed out but to the thousands of students that are involved every year. It's all intrinsic motivation. That we want to create ventures in this entrepreneurship ecosystem, but it's learning, it's community-wide learning, it's pervasive learning that pushes into all the corners of the university that is really exciting. And leadership, is not vested in any one person or group of people at the top. Yes, you need leaders of each organization, but leadership is diffused through empowered people who really feel that they have the authority to run with it. And everyone owns a piece of this community. So those characteristics, I think, are universal to any successful, enduring, sustainable community. That, I think, is key to how it grows, how it manages challenges, and how it moves on to the future. So now I will turn to the panelists, and I will ask Jordan to kick off with she's already briefly described the community that she is part of. But to talk about what in the development of it, of IDEA in particular, as it exists today, keeps people so attached to it. What are those characteristics that you find are tremendously important in that community? If you could spend 2 or 3 minutes talking about that, that would be great.
Absolutely. I think it's important to acknowledge when discussing IDEA's community, the history we come from, which is that IDEA turned 10 years old this year, which is super exciting. And we clearly, from this panel, if you can't tell, have a history of alumni who are still engaged in the program, which is great. But before 2 years ago, there was no community team in IDEA. Nobody was really consciously thinking about this beyond the way that everybody kind of owns community as being a part of our community. So we've spent the past 2 years thoughtfully thinking about what community means, what the IDEA community means, and how to kind of take the values that everybody shares and bring them to the table. Because ultimately, at the end of the day, what really shapes a community is that buy-in, that intrinsic buy-in of each individual. So I think that, when thinking about our IDEA community, some characteristics that really come to mind that really strengthen our community and bring everyone together is this passion for, learning and experiencing. If you think about where we come from and that we go to Northeastern, it makes a lot of sense that, we'd be hungry to learn, we'd be hungry to try new things, get our hands dirty. But, regardless of background or industry, that's something that every single person who's involved in this community brings to the table is, they're so curious, they're ambitious, they love solving problems, building solutions, learning from other people about, what they're excited and passionate about. They have determination, and, they refuse to accept things that are a certain way just because they've always been that way. And because of that, I think, building is a collaborative effort. No single person has all of the answers. No single person knows all of the right steps. So it's about harnessing that collective intelligence and that thought diversity and bringing different people who are passionate about different things to the table and really harnessing that breadth of knowledge to build better things and make better decisions. And so when we think about navigating tough times, like right now, that's a lot of what we fall back onto in IDEA is that thought diversity and appreciating the unique perspective that each person has, accepting, their expertise and trying to figure out how to collaborate in a way that supports all of our community members.
Great. Wonderful. Roy, do you have examples of communities that you've been involved in that you can chat about on this point?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, beyond IDEA, obviously I operate in the private sector, so I don't have deep involvement with them. I guess, what I'll add to things that have been said is, and these are just purely observations, there's no question that I see communities tend to form, and some of this is stating the obvious, but, around kind of a shared pain or objective, right? So just by way of example, and this is somewhat of an oddball one, I guess, in the context of our conversation here, but, the real estate agent who sold us our condo a couple of years ago, he specializes in the South End. And, when the pandemic got really ramping up and businesses were being forced to shut down, he actually sent an email blast out to everybody on his list, both residents and local businesses, and he took it upon himself to try to arrange online communities where he was acting as a focal point to get their concerns shared with our local state representative. So I think, the observation I take away from that is obviously shared pain points for a group of people, right? That just naturally coalesces. But I think what's also interesting is, you've got a person who, has, talk about somebody who has a vested interest in maintaining the vibrancy of a neighborhood. You can't really pick anybody with more of a vested interest than a real estate agent. So, while there's a monetary incentive, there is also just a larger incentive generally for him to try to maintain and build a community of participants. And he acts as kind of a node and a concentration point for these people in a way that they wouldn't necessarily know who to even raise their hand and reach out to. So I think it's important in any community, and Dan and I and Chris, we've talked about this before, how even though it's a collection of people, it just still seems to be important, on an individual level, that somebody takes an initiative and raises their hand and starts pulling people together. I'm always impressed by how, the most forward-thinking communities really have that impassioned individual, like a Dan Gregory, like a Jordan, like a Chris, like an Abby, who really go the extra mile to pull everything together for that particular group or community. So I just throw that out there as an observation.
Thank you. Nina, what do you feel are, if some characteristics, are there characteristics that haven't been mentioned that you feel are really noteworthy in forming communities or maintaining communities?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so I think something important here to point out is that there's a difference between the people who start communities and the people who participate in them. And they're both equally important. I think, yeah, I'm sure everyone here, the vast majority of us have seen that video. It was a music festival where that one guy starts dancing like a maniac, and then some more people join in, and then another group of people join in, and all of a sudden, it's describing how a movement starts. And what the guy says when he's narrating this video is, he's really articulating how important it is that there's this one, crazy wild person who goes out and on a limb and starts this whole thing, but that it's nothing without all of the other people who jump in and participate in that. And that's true of any community, no matter where it falls, whether it's 3 people or 300, that's always the case. And the thread within that, which to answer this question, quite straightforward, is that, and I've had this problem a lot myself, and it's absolutely an opportunity for growth, is realizing that although you may be the one who started a community, you're oftentimes, especially at the beginning, the most passionate about it, and you have a very specific vision in your mind about what exactly that is. And it's important to realize and remember that, to Dan's point, a community has to be in some ways let loose to be able to build on itself and to create and expand with everyone that's part of it. And also realizing that although your perspective and the way that you think the community should be built might be right, it doesn't mean that other people in the community are not also right. And I think Jordan mentioned this too, it's being open to, the thought-provoking conversation around, well, what else could we possibly do? You don't have to necessarily agree and say, that's what we're going to do next, but it is important to open up that space and say, well, what is the sort of next iteration of this? Or where have we fallen short? Or where could we be better? And that's a scary moment. It's a very vulnerable moment to open yourself up to your community, again, whether they're 3 or 300, and say, where are we succeeding? Where are we failing? And what can we do that's different? And I think that the communities that do that do open themselves up, the leaders of those communities, the ones that also enable others in their community to do that, are the most powerful, because they show to their constituents, to their community, that we care about what you think. This is not, I am not a tyrant leader of a community that thinks that only my way or the highway. And I will wholeheartedly admit that I have been in situations in the past where, you know, you get so caught up in the thing that you're building that you forget that you're not the only person that's part of your community. And it might be faster, more efficient, seemingly to just go with your own ideas. But I promise you that to ask the question and allow that information to enter your mind and your process, it's going to always create a better outcome for the rest of the community, not necessarily just yourself.
I think you are spot on. Chris?
Yeah, I think one thing
you go last because everyone has covered everything.
I think I've got one or two things that haven't been covered, but we'll see. Give me a thumbs up or down at the end. I think one thing that I've seen consistently as a difference between communities that succeed and communities that fail is community is a long-term play. It is not, and far too often you see this, and I've seen a ton of it, unfortunately, with COVID, where people are like, we're going to do this thing for the next 3 months. That's not going to be really what community is. If you're taking probably anything less than a 10 to 20 year timeline view on what you're trying to build, you're not really building a community, you're building a marketing campaign. And then once you decide, hey, I'm doing something for 10 plus years and committing to it, the next thing is, what is the actual goal? Is it a social change? And we see a lot of that happening now. And those people aren't committing to doing this for a week or 2 months. You know, everyone that's really committing to communities to change social issues are committing to that for long term. The second is, it could be just social connection. You do see this with art interest groups, with poet societies, whatever those is, or whatever those are. Those aren't something that someone's like, hey, I just want to do 3 meetups about a cool topic that I'm interested in. Those people are going to be passionate about that forever. And then the third is, and there are communities around this, it's just purely economic. Think about a lot of customer communities and things like that. And as long as you say, I'm taking a long-term goal, set whatever that goal is, then you have some direction, and then you can pull in people that, like Nina said, don't have the exact same view of how to execute this. But if you can get people that have the same goal, you're going to build a vibrant community. And then the secret is, once you have those two, is let the leaders lead. The best thing you can do is get enough people involved that want to take initiative and let it run. And know some things are going to fail, and that's okay. But just continue to push and grow. So
Chris, follow-up question: Can communities how do communities operate with in a very strict top-down environment?
I think top-down can work as long as the top is okay letting go of power and being known as being in charge. So I have seen organizations, and this tens of time will happen with a company, right? A company will say, we're going to start a community for our customers or our users. If they're saying, hey, our goal is just monetize the crap out of this, it's probably not going to be successful. If it's, hey, HubSpot's a great example. They built community after community around, and actually Nina can probably chime in on this because I know she had a bunch to do with it, but around inbound marketing. And they said, we want marketers to get better at marketing. And sometimes it led to customers, sometimes it didn't, but pushing that top-down initiative probably gave it the resources. And what top-down, the only advantage you might have is you have more budget faster. But if you use it the wrong way, you're going to just crush the community. So I think top-down is hard, it's doable, but it would have to be inclusive from day one, and a leader that is okay with, ultimately leading from behind. Servant leadership is an interesting topic for people to kind of look into, and ultimately be serving the people, not leading the people. And once you can make that shift, as long as the people running the organization believe that thoroughly, I think you have a chance to be successful even top down, but just doesn't get the same momentum as a grassroots type movement.
Anyone want to jump in on that comment and build on it?
Yeah, I would love to. So to the servant leadership thing that Chris brought up, it reminds me of the Leaders Eat Last book, which is a great read for any leader. And it's also just looking back at my own organization. So at Accelerator, our founder has amazing qualities. I mean, he is an incredibly selfless person. He is, he has all these really great traits, but I think one of the most defining moments of his leadership in the last 2 years has been him realizing where his strengths are not, right? Where his strengths do not lie, and bringing in people who have those strengths and allowing them to do what they do, even though it makes him uncomfortable. And I think that, and I happen to be listening to Brene Brown's Daring Greatly right now. And she just, talks about this idea of it was, I think it was like a hedge fund manager or something, or consultant founder of a consultancy saying, giving in and saying, look, like his vulnerability was opening up and saying that, I don't know all the answers. I don't necessarily know what needs to be done all the time. And I think a lot of leaders and founders, especially, this is such a common trait amongst the two of them, is that they feel like they have to know everything, do everything, always be the person who does the thing. And I think one of the most empowering things that they can do for themselves and that others can do for them is say, hey, friend or person, like, you don't need to be everything for everyone. You do need to be really good at the thing that you're doing. And you need to be even better at finding people who can step in and do the thing that you're not able to do. And once you do that, and when you're open about it, if you don't hide it, because I think if you hide it, it doesn't look as authentic. But when you're open and say, like, we're bringing this person in because they have this strength and we don't have that yet, it opens up the arena for the rest of your team, in this case, or your community, to say, oh, it's okay to not be great at everything, right? The bar is not actually here, it's here, and that's okay. So then I'm also empowered to be open and say, look, I'm really great at this thing, but I'm not so great at that thing. And that's the environment that you want to create, is this environment where, I'm sure for a lot of us, this has come to fruition right now, where, you open up the doors, I know we did, for people to talk openly about what's going on right now. And all of a sudden, all of this flooded out. And I remember asking myself the questions, like, what kind of environment did we create that people didn't feel empowered to bring those things up before? And that's in addressing what's happening right now. But create those environments, be authentic and be vulnerable, and it will permeate through the rest of the organization.
So I'd like to move the discussion forward by keying off of what I think I've learned so far, which is that the communities that diffuse authority and responsibility across the organization and empower people are going to be the most sustainable. So let's talk about when a well-oiled machine operating in that fashion comes across a crisis like COVID and immediately has to go virtual. How do great communities respond to crisis when often in crisis? I mean, honestly, and I hope I don't get into trouble for this, a little strong leadership in this country right now at the top would be helpful. So that, how do you respond to singular events when you have authority spread so widely? And I throw it out to anyone.
Actually, Katie Humble asked a good question, which kind of pertains to this, which is, how can you suggest a community leader to incorporate, several stakeholders in the feedback process in order to evolve and grow the community? But I think also this pertains into a conversation whenever you're dealing with something like this, where it's a crisis or you're doing crisis management. So I think going off of Nina's point, and Chris's, where you're working with top down, what are feedback or processes that you can incorporate in bringing in feedback or stakeholders into the conversation? And how can you make sure that, like you're saying, it's effective and people feel heard and it's implemented?
I want to just throw something first into the original question before diving into Katie's. I think actually when crises happen, communities that are actually communities, which means they're strong groups with aligned goals and visions and passions and ultimately true trust, have no real change besides, are we meeting online or are we meeting in person? What it ultimately does is shines the light on, for lack of a better word, BS organizations that say they're a community, where it's a thinly veiled either transaction or something that hasn't developed yet. So I actually think what you see in the really strong communities is actually them where they go from tight to even tighter. I saw, as an example, I run the Boston Techstars chapter, and we used to do monthly meetups, and We do that every month in person in general. When COVID kind of hit, when we reached out, and actually this will weave in Katie's kind of thought, we said, hey guys, what do you need? Do you need more events, more panels, this and that? And they said, you know what, honestly, and this was 3 weeks ago, every single person's just throwing a panel on us right now on PPP, on SBA, on all this. And like, I don't need that at all. I need 30 minutes with someone I can trust to say, I'm scared. I don't know what's going on. This is broken. So those really strong communities, what I actually saw is, and it's scary as a community leader, is the communications and interactions that are happening are immeasurable because they're one-on-one. It's text messages, it's phone calls. And what I think will happen is in 2 to 3 months, when things hopefully get a little more normal, people leading communities are going to see either no one come back to their events or their events all of a sudden be triple what they were. And the ones that are triple what they were probably people that there was all of this stuff happening. And yes, as a community leader, you can help facilitate it and you can shine light and say, you know, hey, Nina did this great thing where she reached out to 5 founders and like inspire others to do the same. But I really do think that in a crisis, the really strong communities actually double down. The ones that tend to flounder were really, like I said, glorified marketing campaigns.
Great response. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd love to jump in here.
Good.
Yeah, so I think that when thinking about communities and tough times, ultimately, the reason you're part of communities for a lot of reasons, and that might be different per community, but I think that ultimately it's a group of people who, you know, when times get tough, ideally you should be able to lean on them and discuss what's going on with them in some form or another. And things like COVID-19 really, I think, strip away all of the, for lack of a better word, BS in the world and really show you what's important and what's not. So I think that in times like this, either your community is going to succeed and people are going to be like, wow, I'm really grateful to, you know, have this organization, or they're going to realize that it doesn't provide value to them. And ultimately, that's one of the biggest things, I think, and some of the secret sauce to success in community is that you kind of have to just let it, and I think this has been, you know, talked about before, but you just have to let it be and let it be what it is and let people kind of run with it. You ultimately want your communities to be self-sustaining, because if you're forcing people to come together and talk about these things, and it's not of their own will, it's not a community, you're forcing people to have a conversation. So I think that it's important to give yourself the grace if you're working to build or, you know, reinforce a community to fail, because I think that, you know, failing, you know, life going wrong, things catching on fire, that is what brings people together. That is what makes us stronger. That is what makes us, you know, realize what's important. And so I think that these things, both at an individual and a group level, will have a really big effect on communities, hopefully in a positive way. But if it's not in a positive way, it'll probably be in a productive way. For IDEA personally, going more over to Katie's question, you know, we've had a lot of issues in the past with making sure that everybody's voice is heard. There's a lot of different stakeholders, a lot of people who are involved at different levels, and, you know, who have a lot of different opinions and a lot of different backgrounds. And it's really hard to make sure that, you know, you're hearing what matters through the noise. So something we've done to try and make sure that we're connecting more closely with our communities is specifically for our venture community this year, we built out a venture advisory board. Basically, whenever we were offering programming or resources to our ventures, it always felt like we were hitting this wall that we couldn't get past. And we couldn't really, there was some sort of like issue where we weren't putting out offerings that were relevant to them, or they weren't engaging or didn't see the value in what we were trying to provide for them. So we decided to bring the ventures closer to us and to the community team. And we built a venture advisory board comprised of, I think, 7 ventures right now, from a wide variety of backgrounds, stages. Some are remote, some are, you know, different genders, different racial backgrounds and ethnicities, to make sure that we're hearing what people have to say and giving them that voice and giving them that platform. But we're taking it a step further, because ideally we want this community to be self-sufficient, right? Any energy, we want it to be a closed system where any energy we're putting in, like, eventually comes back. So we're also encouraging our venture advisory board members to take the lead in their communities, see what they think is important, see what they're passionate about, what they're excited about, and share that with others, and create it if they have the time, and we'll support them however they want. But I think that giving the community buy-in and kind of disseminating leadership and allowing other people to take the reins is what makes a community. If you think about George Washington, he retired early. He didn't continue being president because he wanted America to live on beyond him. And I think that that's a huge part of a community too, is letting it fail, letting somebody else take over, letting other ideas exist. Because when all these people are contributing to the melting pot, that's what makes it beautiful, and that's what makes it taste good.
Here's to retirement. Go ahead, Nina.
Yeah, I think I'm a tactical person, and I also just saw that someone just put in literally just the word how, that I think is a really apt question.
Yes.
The really important thing to remember is that with COVID and with COVID, with BLM, with anything that happens ever, as at HubSpot, like when I was there, we were going through a pretty traumatic experience thanks to a book. And that's the word that's most important here is trauma, right? Everybody is going through trauma. That is emotional. That's not money. There's obviously money involved. There's bottom lines involved. There's business tactics and success and failures of businesses tied up in that. But at the end of the day, it's just scary. People are scared. And I think I can't tell you what words you should put into an email or a tweet, or if you should call people versus email them. I can't tell you what you should do in that instance, because your community is your community and you know it best, but you know it best because you ask. And I think the one most tactile thing that I can say is just be willing to ask the question of the people in your community, because
what's the question?
Right. So I think one of the questions that can be asked is, how are you feeling with everything going on? Literally just open-ended. How do you feel? And let people put in their responses, whether they be anonymous or not, and don't be afraid of what's going to be said. And then once you say, how do you feel? You can also say, optionally, what do you feel that we could do better? Or what do you need right now? Like to Chris's point, sometimes people need more human connection. Sometimes people actually need some silence. Some people need different things, and decide based on what that response is. What is your response going to be? Because it shouldn't just be you deciding, it should be your community. And then to an earlier point, to the BS point, I think something that's really interesting that has happened with people speaking up and speaking out on various things is there's sort of like a sieve, right? There's a lot of people that you realize who sort of just get sifted out. And that's okay. Being afraid of losing people is not going to serve you. And saying, look, I have to say, I've decided that I want to make not just a statement, but a really intense statement about how I feel about what's going on right now. And that's gonna piss some people off. No matter what you say, it's gonna piss some people off. And you have to be okay with that if you're okay with where you stand. So if you're gonna make a statement and someone responds and says I wholeheartedly disagree with this, but you have definitively said, because you've asked your community, what is important to you? What do you need? And how can I be here for you? And 90% of them say, we need this, and you do that. And then one person says, I hate you for saying this, then say, great, I'm sorry that this isn't the community for you. And then they can leave. I think that's the most important thing. And this is gonna happen across businesses who've spoken up and spoken out and said, this is where we stand. There are going to be people within those organizations say, look, I just don't fundamentally agree with this. And it's on them to decide that that's either why they leave or why they stay.
Okay.
And to follow, I just have one more thing to add on that is, I think it comes down to figuring out which stakeholder, if it's multiple stakeholders or multiple personas of stakeholders, that makes a big difference, because what you need to care about is the member of your community. If your idea, it's the ventures first and then everything else. If your e-club, it was the students and people trying to learn. If you are a company, it's probably your employees first. And if you're trying to say, what Nina's getting to, I think, if you're trying to be everything to everyone, you're never going to satisfy them all. So figure out which persona is the most important, and then go ask the question, how can we help? And I know everyone wishes it would be easy structured data of option A, B, or C, so I can look at the graph and do C. It's not. You have to actually do open-ended and take hours of reading these responses and thinking them through. So I
think we're operating at a pretty high level of generality as we're talking, because we're trying to apply it to any community. So I would love someone to volunteer a short description that answers this question. When COVID hit and we were told to go virtual, my community responded in this fashion.
I could take a stab at it. I think it was, I think being the CEO of IDEA during its 10-year anniversary, I think we were expecting to have a big celebration March 21st, where we're bringing over 400 people to come together. And then within 2 weeks, all kind of changed at once. And I think immediately when you're trying to, specifically with COVID and dealing with how everything went virtual and digital and also bring your community together, I think Nino was right? During a time of crisis, it's trauma, right? A lot of people feel like a lack of control in their life. People feel like there is no clear path forward. No one knew what was happening, including myself, right? I wasn't an expert in, how to manage a pandemic or how to change an operation of a business. But I think in a time like this, the best thing you can do is bring people to the table and also let everyone know very clearly, like what you know and what you don't know, right? So specifically with IDEA, during the conversations that we had when all the announcements were coming out where, unemployment was reaching high levels, where, the countries were shutting down and, big events were closing. And we saw, the school getting prepared to basically go virtual. We had, all hands meeting with my leadership team, basically discussing, hey, this is what we know right now. This is what could potentially happen in the next 6 months. This is what we could go fully virtual. We could also continue as normal. Let's plan for both. And then also figure out who else we needed to go and reach out to. So whether it was from a leadership team of 6 students to then going out and talking to the IDEA board, to then going out and talking and working with experts at Northeastern, basically trying to get as much information as possible and opening channels of communication to all of your stakeholders, whether it's the ventures, whether it's your team members, whether it's your board members, and basically saying, hey, this is the situation. This is what we're currently thinking with our operations. This is where we need help. Was extremely helpful for me in also managing our movement to a digital community. And then moving to digital itself, I think the best advice I got was from one of our board members, Robin Devereaux, which is we need to have a channel that are open for people to discuss. And I think it was discussed before where, it's going out and reaching to people and saying like, hey, this is a time where, an hour on 7 o'clock at night, if we're going to get together and discuss and have a conversation about how everyone's feeling right now. And you're welcome to join and you're welcome not to if you want to, but let me know how I can help and let me know what I can do to better support you. And I think making sure you do your rounds, whether it's, one-on-ones or having a broader discussion with your team on, this is what I know, this is what we don't know, and this is what we can expect to see in the next couple months. And we don't have the answers to all of it, but this is what we know. And if you have any questions or thoughts about it, I think those are the 3 things that I think, try to implement an idea where if someone had a better idea or if someone had a specific feeling about something or if someone wanted to navigate this differently, they were able to be heard. And we could all get on the same page. So whenever we did have to go and move operations online, the right people in the room who were there to execute it, whether it's sending out mass emails to our ventures, whether it was to make sure our coaches knew what was happening, were part of the conversation, knew exactly what was happening. And they also felt like, they were heard and supported in other areas of their life if they couldn't handle it.
So summarize the well-run community, the communities that are operating well don't break out of their decision-making processes and the way that they operate in the face of a crisis, but they maybe take a percentage of their time to react to that crisis and then begin to think about contingency planning along the same axis they were operating before, versus it's a crisis. Everything gets suspended. There's some top-down initiative to make sure that everybody is safe and nobody breaks the rules, et cetera. Do I have that right?
Yeah, and just giving people an opportunity to just speak and have them have that channel to talk, right?
Which is part of the culture of the community before. You didn't say, now that there's a crisis, I better listen to people. You were always listening to people. That was part of the culture of the community, is the point that I'm trying to make. So you adapt.
I can jump in very tactically speaking,
Yep.
like a venture. So obviously venture capital is a relatively specific industry where our entire purpose is to serve our founders and the investor community on behalf of our founders. We've got a little over 150 investments, which is just over 300 founders. So that's like in terms of size of community, which is primarily managed over Slack, which I don't love, but we can talk about that some other time, maybe with Chris. And the initial response was instantaneously creating a channel that was dedicated to COVID conversation. I did this because COVID conversation spans the gamut of productive and not so productive. Some of it is like a lot of words that I can't say and I'm screwed, right? Like, this is terrible, I'm screwed, my business is screwed, what do I do? Help, which is tough to hear. And then the other side of it is like, here's PPP loans, here's this thing, here's how to get through to your bank, like a lot of constructive things. And so I said, okay, well, this is clearly a conversation that everyone is having. We have existing channels that are, the generals and the randoms and the specifics that aren't really built for that. And I would like to keep those clean and clear because, to Chris's point, one day we will come back and I want that channel to stay and hold what it had. So we created the COVID channel. We also did our own work to figure out, so instead of just saying, I think someone said, like, the PPP panels are sickening. Like, there's so many of them. Everyone and their mother has an opinion about how to get money. And it's annoying. And so what we said was like, we're not going to put the work on you. We're just going to do it ourselves. We're going to go to the panels. We're going to listen to the people. We're going to call the lawyers and the banks and the so on and so forth. And we're going to just synthesize this information, put it into a Google Doc and send it to you. And so we did that. And then we had a Q&A with the person on the team who actually went through and did all that work. And then when founder said, my PPP loan is stuck with whatever bank, I would literally text the person I know at that bank and say, hey, like, you need to move on this or tell me what's going on. So that was one big thing. We also sent out, obviously, an email to our founders first and foremost. We ended up asking a lot of the founders if they wanted to create effectively like discount codes for their product to share with other founders in the portfolio so that they were getting more exposure to the rest of the portfolio and getting some business, if any business, if possible, particularly if it was relevant, like digital event platforms, meeting, note-taking, things like that. So there's some like the most immediate reactions was just how can we shrink the community a bit, make it not actually feel like it is so large and bring people a little closer together.
Great. Okay, I'm going to enter our last segment before we throw it open to questions. And that is part of the wonderful quality of communities is that they're communities of people that share a lot and feel shared ownership in the community. And there are people inside that community, and there will always be people outside of that community. How do we manage communities so that they are appropriately inclusive and still maintain that feeling that there's something special here?
Absolutely. I'd love to take this first. So I think that in thinking about a lot of things we've discussed where you can't please everybody, not everybody's going to love your community, not everyone's going to be a fit. A lot of that is the law of attraction, understanding the values that your community stands by, the experience of what your community has, and putting that out there and making sure that in times of crisis, what you're falling back on is that structure and that values will always serve to, I think, attract the right people and repel people who might be a fit for a better community. In thinking about managing the crisis currently, IDEA has a super broad community with stakeholders from, almost, what is it, Abhi, like 72 countries, like almost like everywhere. So in thinking about everything, we've had to be very careful. And so the current team has done a really great job, I think, of making haste, but slowly. And like what Abhi said, looping in the right people from the university, being thoughtful, listening, and trying to make sure that they're saying the right thing and not just something, just to say something and be a part of the conversation. I think that part of thought diversity and inclusivity is giving people a voice and that freedom of speech and a platform in which to talk. People will not always say things that are smart when you give them a platform to talk. I think that that is one of the biggest learnings of the world currently. And so I think that it's important to defend that inclusivity. I think it's important to, if somebody brings up something that you don't necessarily agree with, to have a discussion about it and talk about it, but make sure, if it's somewhere in a public place, like a Slack, for example, to do it in a way where you are making sure that, people feel like they can still speak up and people are welcome to, bring up different ideas without, fear of, becoming a victim of like a witch hunt or something like that. Something the team right now is doing to kind of try and do this is, being very intentional with, their plans moving forward. Diversity has been on the docket for IDEA. We've been working on it a lot this year. Joanna Moore, who was the venture director, had a huge part in trying to make sure that, our team is more diverse, our ventures are more diverse. But I think, it's a slow process where, first of all, you have to kind of open pipelines so that, and actively source people from different backgrounds to make sure that they have a place at the table and are aware of their place at the table. And from there, it's really thinking about your language and how can, what language, I think everyone's language to them seems normal and natural, but it's worth asking people who aren't involved in your community or who might not feel like they can be included in your community, what is preventing you from feeling comfortable joining? Is it the language we use? Is it the way we present ourselves? Are there not enough open pipelines? Because I think that it's important to be inclusive, but you have to be very thoughtful about that inclusivity, right. And making sure that you're giving the right people the right opportunities to come to the table and be a part. And then finally, I think it's about investing in longer lasting change, investing in, programs or initiatives that can actually create this change and, can actually create pipelines that make your organization more diverse or can support people. For example, entrepreneurship is a super expensive route to go generally. And a lot of people don't have the privilege of having, the extra capital to invest in their own business. So doing things like investing in funds so that, people who are not as economically privileged might be able to pursue building a venture or something like that. I hope that encompasses everything the question was.
Thank you. That was comprehensive. Others might comment on this.
I think Jordan hit one really, really key piece that I kind of want to add on is successful communities have to be inclusive of everyone. And if someone says this community isn't for me, it should be for a reason such as I don't like starting companies. Or if I'm joining a knitting club, I don't like knitting. It should not be because they don't feel accepted because of who they are. And that is something to be very mindful of. So if you start seeing a lot of churn in your organization, if it's a standard distribution, that's fine. But if you're churning all the females or all the people of color or all a certain segment, that's actually a problem you need to dive into as soon as possible and figure out why. So it's okay for people to say, hey, I came to an event, this community isn't for me. But that is something that I think, to keep note of. It's okay for people to churn out of an organization as long as it's for the right reasons. And if it's something that you start to see as a trend with a specific segment, you should dive into that with your team, talk to those people who have left the group and see, or organization or community, and see why. Because it's natural.
Last comment from the panel, and then we'll throw it open to people. Abhi, do you have questions from people or?
Yeah, I have a few questions.
Okay.
I can interject with kind of answering a little bit what you said about inclusivity. I think like a lot of people are like asking how. I've had an incredible time traveling because I grew up abroad and we've been traveling a lot, and my parents basically invested in me and my sister getting an education where, I was in Taiwan, Dubai, and so forth. And I think one thing when you're trying to build a community and you're trying to build it in inclusivity, there's different layers of doing it, which a lot of people have said, like opening channels, making sure you're bringing in the right people. But I think also traditions are a good one too, whether it's food, music, cool things that people can get involved in, whether they're activities or events where you're starting to share a little bit more about what your community is about. And I think I just wanted to throw that in there. It's a little lighthearted, but I think that's really important, where it's a good opportunity for someone who isn't involved to basically learn a little bit more about what you guys are up to. And I think traditions are really important But I think traditions are a lot better when you're also being open enough where people have an opportunity to take part in it and participate. And then from there, they'll learn a little bit more about what you guys are about. But yeah, I mean, that was like my 2 cents.
That was at least a nickel.
I can also jump in really very briefly. So the venture industry, startup industry, that whole world is predominantly male and predominantly white. And we have come up against that right now. It is the topic of conversation for a lot of people. I'm sure a lot of folks in this room, just based on who's speaking. I think and we talked about this in the prep call for this too. I think one of the most important parts of acknowledging a lack of diversity in your community, and before you even get to how to fix that problem, is acknowledging that there is a lack of diversity in the first place, and acknowledging that it's based on, like, the statistics show, right, that the vast majority of startup and venture is white and male. So acknowledge that, understand that, and then say, how do we want to be different? And do we want to be different? And is it possible to be different, right? Are there enough founders? Like, we asked the question, like, are there enough Black, Latinx, female founders for us to really realistically make that as many investments as the world that we want to be in? And the answer is yes. And then the next question is, okay, how do we see more Black, female, POC founders? And it's go out and find them. It's not hitting up your Black friend or your female friend and saying, hey, do you know anybody who is Black or a female that might be starting a company? It's just so disrespectful and so lazy. And I feel obviously very strongly about this, but it's building another community. It's saying to yourself, who is my community? Who's in my world? And how can I create the, sort of the cyclical pattern of people, not just me hitting people up to say, can you introduce me to a founder who's not white or male? But they think of me as well. And it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. And the same thing can be applied to your community. It's how do I source a more diverse group of people, which Jordan touched on, so that this isn't just you constantly going out and trying to find people and begging people to join your community who look different than you. It's organic.
Thank you. So before we throw it to the crowd, I mentioned that one of the characteristics of Northeastern's ecosystem is that it's not just about building ventures, it's about learning. And all of these panelists have been involved with IDEA and with Mosaic. And I think the quality of their thinking and their thoughtfulness around the topic of community, around COVID, around Black Lives Matter, is evidence that communities really work. So I want to, and it leaves Roy and me often sitting back and listening and kind of being blown away. And so it's another characteristic is it's amazing how much you can learn from people who are supposed to be just starting out in life. Anyway, thank you panelists. And now I turn it over to my other moderator. And Abhi, can you call on people?
Yeah, so we actually have like a lot of questions. A lot of the people sent them privately. So I'm gonna try to clump some of them together that have a common theme. I think one of them is a little bit more prevalent to like what's happening now, right? I think community is something where, you interact face to face, whether it's an event, it's something that like is really important for a lot of people, that you have that interaction, that physical interaction. But with COVID, a lot of people have to move their communities digitally, right? And I think a few questions have brought up like, what are some tactics in the digital way of community building? Like what are some practices that, you guys have seen or that you guys have seen in your communities that have worked in building communities and fostering it? And then I think to add on to that, during a time like this when, people are separated and dispersed, are there opportunities for people to build new communities and make them accessible? So.
I'd love to speak first. So I think going back to the first question of what is some successful programming that has really worked, the first question you need to ask yourself is what is your community looking for? Because you can do everything for them, but if they don't want it, they're not going to engage with it, and then you're just going to end up being sad and alone in a Zoom call. So I think that, the IDEA community is an interesting example because a lot of our ventures, if they have to choose between work and play for an IDEA event, they will choose work and ignore the play. So they come to us to do work. And so a lot of different events we've had that are more fun or casual, that might work really well in other communities don't work for us. So things that I think are super cool. Something I'm actually doing later is Pillar VC is having a cooking class for their platform team is having a cooking class for their community. So I'm joining in, and I'm going to be making some Asian fruit salad and prawn soup, and probably will mess it up, but it'll be fun, and I'll get to meet new people. I think there are also, in terms of the question of building new communities, I think that there's a lot of opportunities to come together and meet new people and join a cause that's about something bigger than yourself. And there's, really cool new ways to meet people, new tools that are coming out like Lunch Club, which is basically a website that lets you schedule meetings every week with random people you've never met before and just talk about whatever, which is really cool. But I think it's important when considering all of these things to go back to the initial question of like, what will bring people value within my community? And then from there, being very creative about offering, letting people like take the reins sometimes, or giving things that people can interact with, thinking about different types of learners or different types of people and whether they'd prefer engaging with like video or text or things like that. Another really helpful way to build or manage a community now is, of course, Chris's platform Helpful, which really visibly allows you to bring people together and see how they're kind of supporting one another, which is a really beautiful part of being in a community.
Yeah, I've seen, so there's this platform called, so first and foremost, accept that in this new age, you're going to have to try out a whole lot of new technology. So just get past that and be okay with it. There's a platform called Upstream that has a really cool sort of like speed dating feature where they like automatically match you with someone for 5 minutes, and then you kind of just like roll through it. And I've done 2 of them already. They're kind of overwhelming, but they're fun. You just like quickly meet somebody, you can share your contact information and follow up afterward. This is something you can probably accomplish with Zoom as well with the breakout rooms. But I think speed dating, so this is again like getting to know the other members in your community, which just makes it feel smaller. That's a really great one. Fun stuff is always fun, whether you're in quarantine or not. We did we did trivia with our portfolio founders, and there was a cash prize because they all obviously need more money. So we played trivia for like 2 hours, and also like kind of
cash prize.
We did do a cash prize.
How big?
Yeah, so I think it was $200 to the winner, which for us was a big deal. It was sponsored in defense of everything. So yeah, that's another fun one. You can obviously connect people directly. So with us is like we did not invest in Upstream. I love it. Chris DMing me over here. Though I wish we could. If you know your community really well and you know what one person might like and another person in the community might like that too, just connect the two of them. Just be like, hey, I know that you like this thing and I know this other person likes this same thing. Do you mind if I connect you guys? And just start doing those more frequently. I think again, like the resounding statement here is that community building can come to you naturally, but it is an effort. Like it is a thing that takes work. So make some time to get to know some new tech and to kind of get creative.
Yeah. Oh, thanks, guys. I think that was a great way into kind of like looking at different communities. I think Chris touched upon it before, and we have a question here. Chris touched upon like customers being one community, right? And I think, we're talking about employees, we're talking about like clubs, and we're also talking about like organizations. But I think there's a whole community that I think a lot of companies are trying to get a lot closer to. It's a little hard now. But I think a good question was brought up, what percentage of community is for commerce, or is it more than that? And how do you kind of go about reaching those individuals and folks, especially now? And, how do you build a community for individuals like that? So, and I think maybe Roy could also step in on that as well.
Yeah, I guess, that's a little bit tougher one, right? Because it gets to what many people have already voiced here, that, communities, like if they're real, then they tend to not be like just superficial marketing channels. And so it's a little bit of a fine line, I guess, between developing an actual community around a product or brand that evinces real value versus just what is ostensibly another, sales channel, right? Or marketing channel. I mean, I think an interesting one, which is a company that actually was born out of, got some funding from IDEA, was this startup Bureo, which is ostensibly kind of a social responsibility company, but they do it through commerce, right? So they've established networks to recycle plastic fishing nets and repurpose them into commercial products. And I think so the key to at least what I see for successful businesses that generate some community around their brand and can turn it into a piece of their commerce is that there is some greater underlying message behind what they're doing other than just promoting pure commerce, right? That's just my observation on it.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at, and I'm sure Abhi will love to have his 2 cents about this, but if you look at some of Simon Sinek's work about Start With Why, I think that that's a really key indicator, just generally in businesses, of success and people being excited what they're doing is if they have a very strong, purposeful why.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'm a huge Simon Sinek fan. I've also been asked recently a lot, like, what's my why as a 2020 grad? Still trying to figure that out as I'm still kind of learning about it. But I think the examples you give, right, in terms of like working with commerce and your customers is you really want to build a following at the end of the day where people understand why your business or why you're building a community. And I think he does a good job in providing Apple as an example, where their purpose or their why in building their customer base was really on, they're disruptive, they're breaking the status quo, and on the side, they're building computers. There's a whole TED Talk on it, which I highly recommend people watching, which explains it way better than I am. But I think looking at really, who are your customers and why they wanted to work with you guys in the first place, and what are their needs for you beyond also just like the product itself or the service. And really honing in on, what you can do to basically maintain communication and figure out what their needs are, especially during a time of crisis, is important. But yeah, those are my 2 cents. I got actually another good question. I think a lot of us have basically been in a situation, whether, it's different ages or different experiences, where maybe a pandemic or something like that, where a lot of us don't have a lot of answers to, and no one's a leading expert in handling it. A good question came about where, how does decision-making happen where, you could be in a room where no one is the clear boss, or, or someone has to take up the mantle and lead, but no one has those clear answers. And how do you go about leading with peers in a way? We've experienced that, whether it's in Mosaic or in other organizations where, specifically in a time like this, where no one has that clear answer or that leading expertise, but how do you go about managing a situation where you do have to lead in a community where you don't have that expertise?
What I've seen the best there is in a lot of communities, like I said, you let the leaders step up and lead. And if you're in a group in a room talking through a problem and only one person has an idea and they're willing to go try to pull that off, let them do it. And if it fails, you're going to be one step ahead of where you were rather than sitting in a room and arguing. The biggest mistake I have seen in communities is trying to get it perfect. And in matter of fact, trying to get it right instead of just getting it done and then iterating. So I would say if you are willing to if you have the idea or someone else in the group has the idea, unless you're willing to do the work and believe in your idea more, let that person do it and support them however you can. So if all the panelists are on this call, we have no idea what to do, and Nina says, you know what, I'm going to do it this way. If I don't have a better idea or I'm not willing to do the work, I need to shut up, sit in the corner and help however I can. But really what the goal should be is how do we let people lead? And it doesn't have to be right. It just needs to be progress and then learn from it.
If you have a culture of diffuse authority and leadership, then people are not jealous of other people's leadership role and are much less likely to challenge those other leaders because it's Nina's turn to run with the ball, like it was my turn to run with the ball last week. And so this leadership is shared and diffuse, I think is an important part of culture for a community.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think following up on that, most of what I've done during my time leading community at IDEA is like softly managing people who don't really work for me and don't get paid. And so that's a really tough thing. I think, you know, from the relationship with the person perspective, you really want to understand what motivates people, what drives them, what they're excited about. If you have a good idea of that, then you'll know when it is right to kind of put them in the game. And I think following up on what Dan said, building a culture where you aren't always the leader is a really powerful preemptive tool to kind of manage these situations, because ultimately in a community, you want it to be self-sufficient to the point where people are just stepping up and are excited about things, and you just let them run with it. And, you know, also echoing what Chris said, you have to let go of perfection when it comes to community, because you're never going to do the right thing, because anything you think is the right thing, probably like at least a third of the people will disagree with. So there's no really right way, but it's about learning and growing together. And that whole process is what really, I think, builds a tight-knit community. So yeah, just like letting yourself go through it and learn as you go.
I'll jump in as seemingly the only control freak in the group. I have done a lot of personal work to relinquish control. I don't know if anyone else has a similar, actually I think most of us have a similar feeling of, I was the first non-partner, non-founding hire at Accelerator, and I was involved with everything, including starting both of our second and third office. One was in a foreign country. So I have a very strong association with literally everything at the company. And we've gone from 2.5 years ago being 3 people now to 11. And that feeling of letting go is terrifying and exhausting, and it has caused anger, tears, like every single emotion under the sun. And I'm seeing so many nodding heads that like it's real. And this year, frankly, after really candid conversation with one of our directors, he just basically said, he's like, look, if you have to trust that the people you've put into leadership positions are going to do what's right. And if they feel overwhelmed, which is one of my major concerns, was I felt that some people had too much on their plate. I didn't trust that they could do that work. You have to trust that they will do it. And if they can't do it, they'll speak up. And that's all you can do, right? You can't force someone to telling you that they're stressed out. You could open the field, you open the aperture and say, are you, ask if you are. And so to everyone's point, the way that I manage this is I just ask, right? Someone on our team, the youngest and most new person on our team led our bias and resiliency talk actually within the company last week. And she reached out to me and she said, can I do this? Like, can I lead this? Can I start the conversation this way? And I said, absolutely. And can you just send me the questions that you're going to ask? And that's it. Like, I just wanted to see them. And that was my way of saying like, okay, I know what's coming. I can understand what the conversation is going to look like. And one of the questions she wanted to ask was like, can people share, the first question she wanted to ask was, can people share moments in which they felt discriminated against or that there was bias against them in some capacity? And I was like, wow, that's a tough question. And so I asked her, I said, well, what would you say in response to that question? She shared her answers. And I said, cool, would you actually mind going first so that you can sort of set the stage for everybody else to go either as deep as you did or as light? Because she had, multiple like really tough situations and also some like more lighthearted ones. So those are ways that, if you are someone who is nervous about sort of relinquishing that control, that you can and just realize that you're mostly helping yourself, and that it probably would have been just fine even if you hadn't done all of those things. You can work towards that and hit me up if you do.
I think to add on to Nina, I mean, that was answered beautifully. I think, yeah, I totally feel that too. I mean, I think everyone on this call, and I think a lot of people in the audience definitely like have felt that, right? When you have to like give up control. I think one of the things I found from this year was just seeing people like kill it when you put them in a point of responsibility and they have to take the charge on something, and then you see kind of stumbles, but it's okay, and you see them kind of like run it through. But 6 months later, you just see them completely become a different person and are able to kind of see that growth in people. It's just phenomenal to see, and it's probably like the best feeling in the world, in my opinion. But I do like also agree. I think Chris gave me this advice like a year ago when I was like freaking out about running Idea, was you just have to be a cheerleader in a lot of these situations, and just really support them, because the work gets done through like amazing people who just kind of step up. So yeah, I agree. I think to add on to kind of like community building, because a lot of us have focused on it, who are really passionate about it in this call. And I think a lot of people joining, I think really are looking forward to either maintaining, or growing, or kind of looking at what community looks like in the coming years. One question that has come up a lot of times is, you know, what does community look like in the next 5 years? Like in terms of how can you build a community now, or how can you maintain a community and grow it in the next 5 years? And what does that look like? What should people keep in mind? What are best practices? And I think now more than ever, a lot of people are looking to see, you know, we're trying to either reform or build or grow a community, and we want to do it right? So I think, you know, there's not always one clear answer to it, but I guess like, what are some people's opinions on what does it look like in the next 5 years, and how can I go about building it?
One thing that I feel very strongly about this is there's community is a tough word because it's a big spectrum. Like I kind of personally look at groups, then organizations, then communities, then movements, depending on size, scale, complexity, number of players. What I do actually kind of think we will see over the next 5-year window, I actually think 5 years from now, we'll be probably right back to where we were pre-COVID. Maybe even 3 years from that, we'll be back to that. I think people are a little bit over-indexing on there's never going to be an event again. I don't think there will be for a year, maybe 18 months, but it will return to normal when it comes to event-type community. But I do think it will force a lot of communities to realize what they are really providing to their members and is it valuable. So some things that call themselves communities might really just say, you know what, I'm a meetup group, and once a month we do a meetup about Node.js development, and that's it. That's totally fine. And then community is going to need multiple stakes. So, you know, community, the Boston startup community, if you look at that, no one owns it, but that is a pure definition of a community. There's lawyers, there's startups, there's PR firms. Like there's so many pieces playing into that the overall community, when you look at big ecosystem communities, they'll be the same. When you look at building your own, I think really what's going to happen is people are going to get forced to say, how do we actually provide value to these members? Why are people part of it? And then how do I continue to deliver on that promise? And if that, you know, promises we're going to give you the best education on underwater basket weaving, sure, then that's what it is. But you need to find what that is, because people are going to be forced with, especially in the next 12 months, you know, their time, even though they do have a lot more, is also very precious. You know, people are stressed and they don't, you know, have that extra 2 hours after work to just go to the random thing. You've got to actually tap into it. So I think you'll see smaller but tighter knit communities, and hopefully people get unobsessed with the bigger is better. You don't need 50,000 people in your community for it to be strong. You need 20 really dedicated people. So
I'd add the comment too that, and Chris is a good example of this, that the technology, we lag technology. Our behavior lags the technology's capability to help our lives. I think we just caught up a lot with technology. the adoption of Zoom and other technologies, you know, the fact that you could do a whole panel on technologies for managing communities and you know, hold people's attention. So I think we have incredible tools. And the other thing, which is a double-edged sword, obviously, is we have so many frickin' problems that obviously a government situated in Washington, any government situated in Washington, I would argue, has a really difficult time addressing in a systematic way. And so I think we will find that there, and I think Black Lives Matter, and just the outpouring of youth towards solving problems will foster the creation of countless communities, which will be able to get together in the not too distant future. So I actually am I always see brightness in the dark, and I honestly believe that we are almost headed into a renaissance of action, of community action, where a lot of the really critical problems that we face, whether it's the environment, whether it's education, whether it's public health, whether it's policing, whatever it is, we will have the tools in an unparalleled way to address them, and we have the youth who are motivated to solve them. And so I'm very hopeful generally.
I wish there was like a finger snapping emoji, because I'd just be snapping the entire time we're talking. I am so excited for what's coming next. I wholeheartedly agree with Chris, wholeheartedly agree with Dan. I think that I truly believe that we will come back to normal, but the major difference that even in a world of normal is going to be a painful teacher experience for me has been realizing, and this will make sense by telling it to you, but my partner is an introvert and I am an extrovert. And one of the most important realizations has been that extroverts, the world as it stood prior to this served extroverts, and that now the world serves introverts. And the beauty, and I get goosebumps just talking about it, the opportunity is that from here on out, those people are no longer ignored, that introverts are just as important, and the way that they participate in community is just as important. So what I hope and what I do see happening, even and within organizations, I also see in a similar vein, much more emotional, people showing up more emotionally. Everything from, I've realized that I want to be home more with my kids, and I realize that I don't want to commute 2 hours to work every day, and that I want to have a 3-day weekend because I need that to recharge, or I need to take a day off in the middle of the week. Like all of these changes, people are being forced to come to terms with what do I actually want my life to look like? And I think that the future of community and of organizations and everything that involves people connecting with other people is really acknowledging those things and no longer ignoring them, no longer saying that, I am one person at work and I am one person at home unless I want to be. So I'm actually really excited. And I think there's just going to be a lot more virtual stuff because it's easy. Like it's so much easier for me to show up to yoga from my room than it is to drive to the freaking studio, wherever it is.
All right. Ending on that happy note, I would like to thank all of the panelists for their wisdom. And I would like to thank all of the attendees for giving us the time to share our thoughts.
On behalf of the rest of us, we'd like to thank you. And thank you, Abhi, for being the co-moderator. And thank you all for joining us. This was a fantastic conversation. And we look forward to being able to share it with many more alumni via the recording. So thank you all for joining us.
All right.
Have a
Thank you.
good one.